You're with Mags on Media, and now some brand news in brief. She owned 2017, and the Fearless Girls winning streak continues. Now she takes home 5 gold pencils for the McCann New York agency at the prestigious One Show Award ceremony. Fearless Girl was also the inspiration for a young advertising industry hopeful, Jade Delaney, who transformed herself into the Fearless Girl and then stood outside the McCann Bristol office, all in the hopes of getting a job. Well, the ploy worked. The young copywriter bagged a 1-month trial at the agency for thinking outside the box. Now, it's common cause that newsrooms these days are understaffed and under-resourced. And one tool at our disposal right now is a website called The Conversation. Essentially, it's well-written, well-edited, well-researched academic commentary on a variety of issues that is then free to use under common license. So 3 years on, why has this become so important to the media? Caroline Southey is the editor of The Conversation Africa. Caroline, I hope I've got the description right and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But what was the genesis of the project? What was it set up to do?
The genesis was that academics were saying they didn't want to be interviewed by the media because they felt they couldn't trust it. This was in Australia in 2010. And somebody had a light bulb moment and said, why don't you put the knowledge of academics, combine it with the skills of editors? And the first conversation was launched in Melbourne. The second was launched in the UK. Then we launched, and then the US launched. And since then, there's been one in Paris and one in Canada. How
do you source your material?
2 ways. Academics come to us and say, we've got new research coming out, and we'd like to write an article for The Conversation. The second way is that we meet like a normal newsroom. I've got 11 commissioning editors, brilliant team, South Africa and Nairobi. And we discuss ideas as one would, as journalists do, and come up with ideas, contact academics and say, would you be interested in writing on? We're very careful to source academics in their area of specialization. And then they agree. Very intensive editing process.
Well, that's the next question, because I'm assuming what you are given is not necessarily what we see on the website. There's a different style of academic writing compared to the stuff that you and I do.
It does look very different when we get it by and large.
Yeah.
But what we've found, I mean, we've published over 3,000 articles, and we've had 2,000 academics write for us, and they've been incredibly gracious. So it's an iterative process. We go through it, we ask questions. We've always got the reader in mind. If we can't understand this, reader's not going to understand it, so please explain it. We very often do find the most interesting part in the last paragraph, and we hoist it up to the top. The fail-safe for academics is that we can't publish anything until they've agreed. They actually have to press an approval button. So it's a very, very intensive process.
Let's rewind back to the first statement that you made, and I also think this maybe goes to the state of journalism in South Africa right now, is why there was that level initially of mistrust between academics whose thoughts, whose ideas, whose process we need in this media business, and why there was a level of mistrust between the two parties. What does that say about us on this side of the fence?
I think it's pretty common cause now, Jeremy, that journalism is in a state of crisis, that newsrooms are shrinking, specialization has gone out the window. When you and I worked at the Financial Mail 20 years ago, it was a highly, highly specialized publication.
And heaving with specialists.
Completely. Yeah. And so across the board, newsrooms are shrinking. And why? Because we know the old business model of newspapers has collapsed, and nobody really has come up with a new model. And so we hit a sweet spot. There was a desperate need for material. I mean, we publish 4 stories a day. 95% of our articles get republished by at least 2 other media outlets. So it's like the sponge effect. And in a way, that's sad. For me as a journalist, it's sad, because it tells me that newsrooms are in a desperate state.
And without this pipeline or this filter that you're providing, then, what is the consequence to the general public, to readers, to listeners, to viewers, if they're not getting that level of information the journalists should be trained to do and should be offering without perhaps the assistance of a website like yours? We're poorer for it, aren't we, as audience?
I mean, you can be sort of apocalyptic about it. I refuse to be, because I think that there are innovative ways of producing material. There's still very good quality material, despite the tremendous pressures that people are working under. And an innovation like The Conversation begins to fill the gap. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think that we bring a huge amount to the party, and there will be others like us that will similarly tap into knowledge that hasn't been tapped into before.
One of the aspects that I find very encouraging about The Conversation is how it interlocks journalism and science, because previously there was a scarcity of good, credible science journalists. I can't think of a single specialist, dedicated science journalist in the country right now.
You make it sound as though that's very new. Actually, I think science itself has been bad at communicating what it knows to the general public. We know names like Hawkins, we know people who broke those barriers, but they were very serious barriers. Interesting you use the word translate. What we do, I consider to be a massive translation service. We translate science into a language that ordinary people can understand. But I think the barriers have been there through the millennia, quite honestly.
And Caroline, this thing called the common license, I mean, how does that work? Can anyone, can the NCA, for instance, if we want to pick something up, but there has to be direct attribution?
Two conditions. You don't change it. Some websites like to rework the headline, and we don't get too fussy about that. And some publications cut the original article. That's okay.
Which is the nature of journalism,
exactly.
As we know, yeah.
And the second is attribution for the academic and for the conversation.
What has this done for the reputation of academics, I wonder?
It has absolutely lifted their profiles. We're achieving 2.7 million reads a month through Creative Commons, so they're getting extraordinary reach.
3 years on, so you're beyond the toddler phase. Now, where does a project like this head? What's the growth trajectory?
Well, I called it The Conversation Africa when we launched back then. So there are 54 countries, and we haven't got very far.
So you have borders to cross in that respect.
Exactly. Yeah. The whole idea is to have African voices speaking to Africa, but also speaking to the world.
As a former editor yourself and a correspondent, this is a very different type of journalism. How is it? Is it weird?
It's absolutely gorgeous to walk into a newsroom every day. And I work with the most stunning group of editors. It's frustrating because I don't have the levers of power that you would normally have. I can't tell people what to write. I can't tell them what their deadline is. So there are a whole lot of adjustments that I've had to go through myself. But it's a glorious project.
Those aren't little adjustments either. Those are quite big ones as far as I can see. Caroline Southey, thank you so much for talking to us. Good luck with the project.
Thank you.
This is Mags on Media. Coming up, we'll find out who the most followed world leaders on Facebook are. And I'll take you behind the scenes on a love story for a challenger soap brand.